Welcome to the Madness and Grace podcast, where we discuss the connection between mental health and faith. I'm your host, Matt Stanford.
And I'm your co-host, Maddie Stiers. We're so glad you're joining us today.
Each week, we explore personal stories, expert insights, and the profound ways faith can influence our mental well-being. Whether you're seeking comfort, understanding, or simply a new perspective, we're here to journey with you. Thank you for tuning in. Now let's get started with today's episode.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Madness and Grace podcast. Today, we're joined by a special guest, Amanda Shockley. She's working as the Director of Youth Ministry at Memorial Drive Presbyterian Church here in Houston. Thanks for joining us, Amanda. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. I've been working in youth ministry for the past 15 years in one capacity or another. Started as an intern, continued as a volunteer before making it my full-time career, and have been a full-time youth worker for over 10 years now. I've been at Memorial Drive Presbyterian Church for the last 2.5. I'm originally from Pennsylvania, but I made it to Texas as soon as possible, and I don't see myself leaving youth ministry anytime soon. Love to see what God is doing in the lives of our teens.
Yeah, thanks for that. That's a great segue into what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be talking about the intersection of mental health and religion as it relates to youth and teens. And so I invited you on. I thought you would have some good insight to that. So yeah, I'm excited to have this conversation and have you joining us today. And I guess, Matt, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. I'm excited about the conversation as well. I think it's something that's on most people's mind, mental health in our adolescence today.
Yeah. Yeah. So Amanda, working with youth and students, I'm sure this topic comes up, but I guess my first question is, what is the primary mental health struggles that you see when you talk with students or just youth in ministry and in the church?
Yeah, I think it hasn't changed that much other than maybe it's become more intense what they struggle with. Kids still struggle with anxiety as it pertains to their identity and the social hierarchy of middle school and high school, right? That's what when they get into 6th grade, they're trying to figure out where they fit in, who they're friends with, what that says about themselves. Now, in our demographic and where I work here at Memorial, our students, most of their anxiety kind of revolves around that academic stress and what that says about their future, how that plays into what they're going to do after school. So their mental health struggles is huge anxiety and a huge amount of pressure, whether they put it on themselves or it's from parents or it's from their peers. And the weight of that and what they do with it with their limited experience. And so we see kids really struggling with what all that anxiety and what all that pressure says about who they are and what that means for their future.
Do you hear them, because we've talked about this before, do you hear them using the terms like anxiety or like I'm feeling depressed, or is it kind of a step away from those words?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think, so we've been reading a book called Generation Alpha by Mark McCrindle and Ashley Bell. And it's a study, it's predominantly out of Australia, but it's covering this generation that's coming up. And the terms around mental health, right? Even the phrase mental health is no longer stigmatized. Our kids are very comfortable using like, I need a mental health day. I have anxiety, I have depression, or my anxiety, my depression. So those words are used a lot. Now, whether they actually understand the difference between when it's a mental health crisis and when it's a normal amount of anxiety or a sad day, I think they're still figuring that out because they're teenagers. But they definitely are more comfortable with those terms and recognizing those feelings, whether they understand the nuances that comes from, hey, this is something that's been diagnosed. This is something I need treatment for, or I am a student and it's high pressure and I'm feeling anxious about that. That's where I think they probably use those words too much, and wrestling with understanding what that really means is probably a place where they struggle a lot. I mean, don't we all? Figuring out what the severity and when it's time to check in with something more professional versus I can probably get through this myself.
Yeah, a couple of weeks ago, Matt and I were talking on one of the other podcast episodes about how youth do talk about mental health more and it's less stigmatized. And sometimes, it's just navigating, figuring out like the severity of it. And really, when do I need to see a doctor? This is a normal stressor and things like that. So, but I love hearing that, working with youth, you're seeing this actually play out in real life, that students are more willing and open to talk about it and maybe not ashamed to say something, and other students, their cohort members, aren't shaming them for addressing it. So
yeah, definitely not. I think that our students are way more willing to own that they are depressed or anxious or whatever that is than ever before. I never talked about that when I was in high school. Nobody talked about it in high school that was not that long ago. And now even our schools are more aware and have more conversations around that. And for our part as a church, I think we've destigmatized mental health and those conversations, and recognizing the line between what a church is responsible for and where we need to advise them to seek more professional services. That conversation has been happening more and more often, so that we recognize how we best help the people that we're in charge of.
So what does that conversation look like in the church, or how are you seeing that conversation, their mental health and their faith? How are those related in the church? And what are you seeing? How are you seeing that play out?
Yeah, I mean, they're intertwined, right? Jesus quotes Deuteronomy in Mark chapter 12 when he says, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, strength, and love your neighbor as yourself." It's a part of how he sums up what we're on this world to do. And that's our whole person and our whole body. So when we talk about faith, we're talking about how your heart, your soul, your mind, your body intersect. And mind and body, that is mental health, right? That's all connected. And so we talk with our students about what prayer does, what worship does, and how those are tools we've been given to help us reset. Scripture has a lot of amazing truth when it comes to handling feelings of anxiety, feelings of depression, things like that, which are the big two, right, that our kids struggle with, but also self-esteem issues and self-confidence issues. Spending time alone, that's something our kids struggle with, being by themselves and spending time in quiet to reset. But God calls us to come away, to find stillness and quiet, to be in prayer, to lay our burdens at his feet. So we talk about those just in the course of a year. We don't say, hey, this is mental health day and we're talking about this, because it shouldn't be a separate part of their faith. It should be an everyday practice. Every discipline we're called to in our faith can help your mental health, prayer and worship and things like that. So we tackle it just by not shying away from it when it naturally comes up in the conversations we're talking about. How prayer helps, how worship helps, how serving helps. I've said this before. One of my dad's greatest pieces of advice to me I was feeling I'd moved to Houston and was feeling really anxious about starting a new job. He says, "It sounds like you're really thinking about yourself a lot. You should probably think about some of the people you're serving, or go out and do something for somebody else," which is something that scripture calls us to as well. And so I've said that to kids as well, like, hey, it sounds like you're really in your head about yourself. How do you serve somebody else and maybe get out of that mentality? Now, that always has a limit. Kids have their extremes where, we want to bring the parent in and say, hey, how are you guys doing? Is this a conversation you want to have? But we never, as a youth ministry team, think that we are capable of diagnosing somebody with something that needs to be seen by a professional. If a parent asks us for advice or recommendations, we have a lot of resources, including the Hope and Healing Center, but also Memorial Family Therapy Group, that we recommend people to, but only at their request. We aren't professionals when it comes to those extreme cases, and so we'll always recommend them to a professional. And that's probably another way that we help, saying, hey, if you need help that's bigger than what we can offer, we have resources for you as well that we trust and are happy to recommend you to.
Have you found that those conversations with the parents aren't as easy as the conversations with the kids? The children are more open to those discussions, whereas the parents, because they come obviously from a generation where they're not happy to talk about mental health problems. There's a tremendous amount of stigma, and may actually even feel like it's their fault or something they should be ashamed of. When did those conversations happen? You always have them come to you, or what if you notice a problem in the child?
Well, so there's a lot there. To some degree, right, the recognition of needing professional services is a privilege afforded to some demographics and not others. So I would say that in the area that I work in, because they have access to more resources financially, as well as, good insurance and doctors, and it's more normalized with parents to talk about that. To some degree, some parents would rather outsource the care of their kids' mental health to a professional rather than have those conversations themselves. Some, not all parents, not any I know in particular. Just in my experience, some of the problems of our culture is outsourcing a lot of the things that parents need to do themselves. We see some other cultures, right? People with lower access to income resources, or they don't know as much about mental health services or how to access it, or even what that looks like, what that means, right? Does it mean I'm broken? Does it mean that I'm like a crazy person? That still exists in some demographics of the Houston community that we work with. And so those conversations rarely come up about extra help for those people until it hits a point where it's in crisis. For our families that have access, or maybe those conversations are not so awkward, parents are really willing and ready to be like, oh yeah, I can get my kid a therapist. No problem. We typically wait for parents to come to us. It doesn't go well if we approach a parent, we're like, hey, your kid's really struggling. And they're like, I've never seen that. And I don't appreciate that. But part of our job is to walk alongside parents and students. And so when we have a relationship with the family as a whole, those conversations typically go well because we've earned the trust to say, hey, you and I have been talking about some of the things going on in your kid's life. I think it's reached a point where, maybe it's beyond what we can do, or maybe you're feeling overwhelmed. Would you ever consider doing this? And we have resources for you. But we kind of wait for the parent to lead and open the door to that conversation when we've built the trust to have it, without them feeling like we're attacking their parenting skills or attacking their student's identity. And so really it's parent-led. We don't ever want to take the place of a parent when it comes to who knows their kid best.
Right. Great. Yeah. Well, one of the things I think probably comes up a lot, because I hear it all the time in relationship to kids and the kind of decline in mental health that we're seeing, is social media. So I'm sure you're dealing with that on a regular basis. What kind of issues are you seeing in relationship to social media and mental health, and what kind of relation do you see in the connection there between their use of social media, the positive and negative of that, and their mental health?
Yeah. Well, early on in ministry, social media and our conversations around it, when it came to mental health and what kids were doing, it was social media is awful, right? It's the worst thing that's ever happened to kids in their mental health. But it's not going away. And so the response has to become, how do we work with social media and our kids and their use of it to help them not allow it to have such a big effect on their mental health? It just magnifies everything kids go through in high school and middle school. All of those insecurities, all of the, bullying is magnified. Kids are now accessible to their bullies when they go home. That never used to be the case. Isolation, right? Kids know when they're missing out on things because they see it on Snapchat, they see it on Instagram. The glorification of some cultures like cutting and self-harm and things like that. People post videos about those things, and so it normalizes it to some degree. And so those who are most vulnerable and see those things might make a decision that they wouldn't have otherwise if they see somebody else doing it, right? Kids are kind of gullible in that sense. And this generation, more so than most others, feel connected to people they've never met in person. And so these people now have an influence in their life, even though they've never walked alongside them. They don't go to the same school. It's just an influencer or somebody they've connected with via Snapchat or things like that. And so they have a say in that person's life more so than they would have in any other generation, really. And so I think the conversation has to be about equipping parents really to set boundaries when it comes to social media. And I know I'm a youth pastor, I'm talking about parents a lot, but I'm not the primary discipler of our students. That's a parent's job. And so equipping parents to know how to draw boundaries and how to have conversations with their kids about social media, that's where it has to start. It has to start at home. And we can reinforce those things in our conversations about identity and about, again, like taking breaks from loud noises and what voices we allow to speak into our identities and our worth and things like that. But equipping parents by having conversations about what is appropriate and really just awareness, right? So we do try and keep up with what our kids are keeping up with on social media, the Twitch and streaming devices and what YouTubers they're watching, what trends they're following, and having conversations with our parents about, hey, do you know who your kid is watching on YouTube and how it might be influencing what they're doing or how they're feeling about themselves? But that's really where it has to start, is equipping parents to have those conversations first, and then supporting it as a youth ministry that might be more cool and relevant according to our kids and our parents, where we can say, hey, yeah, this isn't good and healthy. Put your phones away. One of the ways we practically do this is on our mission trips, we take phones from our students. So they don't engage with social media for an entire week. They are completely connected to what they're doing and to the people they're serving and the people they're serving with. So that's one of the things that we practically do to encourage kids to connect with their faith and disconnect from social media. That also helps us have a conversation with parents. We're like, hey, your kid said this on the mission trip. Like, I really have enjoyed not having my phone on me because I felt more alive or I felt more present. So that's one of the ways that we practically engage with our kids. We do that on retreats as well. Anytime we have kids for a length of time, we're like, put your phones away. We're going to take them and let them connect with their faith meaningfully and be present.
I love that. It warms my heart to hear that these conversations are going on, because I think about, I grew up in the church and we'd go on trips or, go to church camp or service trips, and we didn't have cell phones. So it wasn't a conversation that needed to be had. So church leaders and staff didn't have to kind of set these boundaries and expectations. It was, we were able to be present and in the moment, and we weren't connected to everything outside of that, but this kids nowadays are. And so there's this different approach that needs to be taken by people in your position to like really get them to be present and involved and to be able to focus in on their faith in that moment and not be distracted by the outside world. And I think that's wonderful. It's a great thing that you guys are doing. Probably hard, because I'm sure not all of the students want to give up their phones for a week.
Do we have some stories? We had a kid bring a burner phone on a trip one time and turn that in instead of his real phone.
Wow. Yeah, they're going to get around it.
Mm-hmm.
So with that, as you have these conversations, like you said, kind of throughout the year, it's not necessarily like you might have one day where you're talking about mental health, but it becomes a conversation throughout and how that relates to their faith and their religious beliefs and whatnot. What are some of the challenges? I mean, you talked about parents. Sometimes that conversation can be a little challenging to navigate, but do you ever get pushback, even maybe not where you're at now, but in past places, about talking about mental health? Or what are some of the challenges you've experienced about integrating the topic of conversation of mental health when you're working with your students?
Yeah, I think when you work in a relational industry, you're taking responsibility for the conversations you're having and what happens after those conversations. So I've never gotten pushback from the churches I've worked for. And part of that is, choosing churches that have a view on the whole person that aligns with what I believe God has called us to and also equipped people in this world to help handle, like mental health professionals. So I've never really received like a ton of pushback on those conversations. I have needed to double check with leadership on what are the systems we have in place for what happens after this conversation. So if I have a student who's struggling or who has, acknowledged to me that they're struggling with self-harm, what do I do after that conversation? Because that is a mental health crisis, right? I'm not equipped to handle that. I have a bachelor's in communications, and while I've worked in youth ministry for a very long time, I'm not a mental health professional. I'm a discipler. And that's a point where possibly there needs to be an intersection of a mental health professional and what we're doing. And so the challenges have been to make sure that those systems are in place with the churches that I work for, that we have resources to point our volunteers to if they have tough conversations with kids about what they've experienced or seen in their life, that we know some of the places. And that's probably been harder in the past than it is now. Especially here in Houston, and my experience with the Hope and Healing Center is access and knowing how to access mental health, especially if you have insurance or good insurance, has been really difficult. Sometimes that's been a barrier for some of our parents. I can't afford therapy. I can't afford counseling for my student. Where do you go from there? So that was definitely an issue more in the past than it is now, where I feel like Memorial Drive Presbyterian Church is really connected to a lot of resources to point parents to. But I would say that for any church who's going to have a conversation about mental health with a student, you need to make sure that you have several layers in place for where that conversation could go. Is it something where you talk about some disciplines they can put in place when it comes to their relationship with Jesus that can help some of those feelings of anxiety or sadness or having accountability? Or does it reach a level where you need to have intervention? And putting that in place and having that written out for volunteers and staff has been helpful in this context. And it's been really helpful. One of my best friends is a mental health professional. And so I usually bounce things off of her and have conversations around mental health and youth and what is and is appropriate for a youth pastor to talk about versus when we need to involve someone professionally. And I think that's really helpful. Youth pastors and church leaders should be in conversation with mental health professionals because we do have a limit to what we can help with.
That was going to be my next question is, we're very close friends. So you can call me and say, hey, like this is what's happening. What are some thoughts, and we support each other in that. But not everyone in your position has a licensed therapist on speed dial. So, how do you see the partnership or collaboration between mental health care providers and the church? What would make it easier for the church or more accessible? How do you see that partnership happening is what I'm trying to ask.
Someone has to go for it. It's not just going to happen. A licensed therapist isn't going to show up at your church and be like, hey, I'd like to be on call for you if you need me. I'd like to help you out. And honestly, it's because God is good that I've ended up at churches that have had either literally adjacent mental health clinics or I've gotten to meet people or we support, like at Memorial Drive Presbyterian Church often has a part-time on-site mental health professional, a licensed counselor available to us. And so in a lot of ways, I've been very blessed that the churches I've worked for have sought out those relationships. If you are in a church that doesn't have that, you have to go seek it out. You have to find someone, typing in, faith-based, licensed counselor. And I would definitely make sure it's somebody who has a license and isn't just like, a hobby counselor. I don't know how to phrase that in a nice way, but like, somebody who took an online course and it was 10 weeks and they want to see people. I would say somebody who has, some hours in counseling people and seek it out and see if, people who are in counseling are in it because they want to help people. So I do believe that it's possible to find a relationship with a licensed counselor who will say, yeah, I'm happy to have conversations with you if you have questions. You're in this industry because you want to see people get the help that they need, especially the Hope and Healing Center. But I do believe that people get into counseling because they want to help people. And so if you as a church leader are struggling with that and want to reach out to the counselors in your area to say, hey, could we figure out how to have a relationship where I can ask questions or, send people your way and, vet those kinds of people? I think that's a good starting point. If you're in the Houston area, you can absolutely contact the Hope and Healing Center, and they definitely will help you, as they have helped me, find people or just bounce things off of people who've been in the industry for a really long time.
Right. Well, That's great. What about, and you are, I know your church, and it's a great church, and they have a lot of resources, but what about, let's say you have some youth leaders out there listening and they're at churches that don't have any resources and they might be in areas where there's pretty limited mental health care providers. And I totally agree with you. We have to do our due diligence on the front end. You have to already know where you're going to refer people. You have to already have those connections before they show up in your office or in your youth group. You can't just in the middle of a crisis go, hey, where's the, let me look something up and I'll find something. But just give us a couple of simple things in relationship to mental health and youth ministry that anyone could put into place that you think has been beneficial in that context, be that a structure or a resource that you use, but regardless of the size or the affluence of the church that you think really makes a difference.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first and foremost, taking care of your own mental health is really important. You can't lead from a place of weakness. So knowing your own mental health struggles and taking care of those, whether that is, setting aside time for yourself and your own relationship with the Lord, which we have to do as professional Christians, so to speak, is make sure that we're taking care of our own relationship with God. So taking care of your own mental health as well, so that you're not trying to pour from a cup that's empty, is super important. And while social media is awful in some contexts, there is a ton of resources online for understanding more about mental health and when it's a crisis, and some tools to use in walking alongside students. And so you can't underutilize the internet, so to speak. You do have to be careful because there's some like crazies out there. But there are also some really good resources, videos to watch, people to follow on Instagram, and utilizing those things to understand it more. And then reading. I mean, we've really enjoyed reading Generation Alpha because it's a long-term study on the generation that's coming up and what they're dealing with. And so understanding some of the things that are going on that we might not understand because I'm from a different generation and what's coming up. Now that's youth specific. So if you're a pastor of an older generation, I don't know how to help you there. But just being well read, it doesn't cost much to do that. So I would say that if you're in an under resourced area, getting online, ordering some books, but also taking care of your own mental health is really, really important.
Well, Maddie, do you have any other questions?
I think Amanda did a great job at sharing some of her experience. Thank you. It was really, I was really excited to have you on. So I really appreciate you coming in and talking with us. And I mean, it's interesting to hear how mental health is being addressed. I know this is just one specific church, but how it's being addressed and how that relates to the conversation of faith with your students, and how you guys, this is a great example of how it can be done and how it is being done in a way that's effective and really going to just foster the continuation of that conversation and relationship with those families and the students. And so I appreciate you coming on and sharing your story and telling us a little bit about what y'all are doing. And again, here's my shameless plug. If you're in the Houston area or Texas and you're at a church and you've got some families or some kids that need some support and you don't know where to start, you can contact the Hope and Healing Center. We vet all of our referrals. And so give us a call. We can help find you, get you connected with some resources in your area. And any last words from either you, Matt or Amanda?
No, just that there's hope for the generation to come. I think that they're going to be okay.
Yeah. Thanks for listening to this week's episode of the Madness and Grace podcast. Make sure to subscribe to the podcast wherever you listen so you will never miss an episode. While you're at it, if you found value in this conversation, we would love it if you would rate the podcast and leave us a review. Lastly, sharing this podcast with a friend or family member is a great way to give hope to those who may be struggling with a mental health concern. See you next time as we discuss Madness and Grace.